The first signal came as nothing more than static. A whisper across the deep void, tangled inside the natural noise of the galaxy. It should have been dismissed, another meaningless pattern in the ocean of radiation that washed through the stars. But it wasn't. Someone noticed. Someone cared enough to listen longer. And when the message was finally decoded, humanity realized they were not alone. It wasn't the first time a signal had been caught, and many thought it would lead to disappointment again. But this one was different. It was old. Very old. Buried beneath centuries of silence, as if a desperate voice had cried out long before we had even touched the sky. The words, once unraveled, were broken, weak. A language no one recognized, though fragments of meaning bled through. Help. Alone. Fading. That was all it took. The world's governments argued endlessly, but people, the ordinary people, could not let it go. Across cities and small towns, across deserts, oceans and mountains, a thought spread. If there were others out there, forgotten and abandoned, then someone had to answer. And who else but us? What followed was the greatest debate in human history. Was it worth risking everything to reach into the dark, to follow the echo of a civilization that might already be gone? Some said it was foolish, that Earth still had wounds of its own to heal. But others whispered a truth that refused to be silenced. Maybe the real test of humanity wasn't survival, but whether we could care for someone we had never seen, never touched, never known. In the end, the answer came not from leaders but from the people themselves. They built, they pushed, they demanded. Humanity's first true interstellar mission was not for conquest, not for wealth, not even for curiosity. It was for compassion. When the ship finally left Earth, its crew carried more than supplies and technology. They carried the weight of billions of hopes. The journey stretched across lifetimes of distance, but the crew pressed on. And at last, drifting on the edges of a forgotten system, they found it, the remains of a world once full of life. The planet was cracked and scarred, its seas dried to salt plains, its cities reduced to stone husks. But what stunned the crew was not the ruin itself. It was the faint glimmer of movement deep beneath the surface. Against all odds, something had survived. The first encounter was not grand or triumphant. It was heartbreaking. The beings they found were shadows of what they once must have been, frail and wary, their voices trembling with a mixture of fear and longing. They had expected no one to come. They had expected to fade into silence. And yet, their humanity stood. For the crew, it was almost unbearable to look at them, an entire people reduced to a handful of survivors, clinging to the memory of what once was. Their eyes held centuries of loneliness, a weight no human could truly understand. But the moment contact was made, when the survivors realized that another species had crossed the stars just to reach them, something changed. Hope returned. The days that followed were fragile. The survivors spoke in broken words, some understood, most not, but the meaning was always clear. They had been forgotten. Once they had friends among the stars. Once they had allies. But when disaster struck, no one came. Their neighbors had turned their backs, choosing silence over aid. For centuries they had waited, until their voices became nothing but a fading echo in the dark. It was a truth that cut deep, not only for them but for the humans who listened. Because what they heard was more than sorrow, it was a warning. This was what happened when compassion failed. This was what happened when life was measured only in strength or usefulness. Humanity could not undo the centuries of suffering. They could not bring back the billions who had been lost. But they could stay. And they chose to. Every instinct said it would be easier to move on, to gather what knowledge they could and leave the fading civilization to history. That was the way of the galaxy, wasn't it? The strong survived. The weak were left behind. But humanity had never been good at following rules written by others. And so they stayed. The decision bound the crew together in silence. They knew what it meant. Staying would be costly, dangerous even. Resources were thin, supplies limited. Helping these survivors would mean sacrifice. It would mean choosing hardship when the safer path was to turn away. But no one turned away. In the weeks that followed, humans worked beside the survivors. They shared food, water, medicine. They rebuilt broken shelters, patched crumbling tunnels, and taught ways to stretch the smallest fragments of energy. For the first time in centuries, the survivors laughed. Weakly, hesitantly, but they laughed. And it was a sound that carried like fire through the underground chambers, reminding everyone, human and alien alike, that life was not over yet. But beneath the joy there was something else. Something unspoken. The survivors never told the full story of why their world had fallen. Every time the question was asked, their eyes would darken, and their voices would tremble with the same phrase: they left us. Who they were remained a mystery. Perhaps other alien races, perhaps even allies who once promised to protect them. Whoever they had been, their betrayal had cut so deep that even after centuries, the wound remained fresh. The humans knew they were only seeing the surface of something far larger. Something dangerous. And yet, they kept going because to abandon these people now would make them no different than the ones who had left them behind. Night after night, as the stars burned cold above the ruined planet, the humans and survivors sat together, exchanging fragments of stories, gestures, songs. It was clumsy, awkward, sometimes even frustrating, but it was real. Bonds began to form. And with them came whispers of secrets buried deeper than anyone had dared to admit. Because slowly, in pieces, the survivors began to reveal that they had not been the only ones destroyed. There were others, worlds like theirs, that had also cried for help. Entire civilizations erased while the galaxy looked away. The humans listened. And as the truth unraveled, one question grew heavier with every passing day: who had silenced so many voices? Who had decided which species were worth saving and which were not? The crew began to fear that in choosing to stay, they had stepped into something far greater than a rescue. Something vast, something hidden, something dangerous. And yet, none of them regretted it. Because for the first time in centuries, the forgotten aliens no longer felt alone. And for the first time in human history, we understood that compassion was not weakness, it was power. Still, there were nights when the silence of the planet pressed too heavily against the heart. Nights when distant tremors shook the ground, and the survivors fell into fearful quiet. They never explained the cause, but their eyes said enough. The danger that had destroyed them might not be gone. It might only be waiting. The humans tried to ask more. They pressed, gently at first, then urgently. But every time the survivors gave the same broken reply: you should leave before they know you are here. And yet, leaving was never an option. Because humanity had made its choice the moment they stepped onto that ruined soil. They would not abandon the forgotten. They would not let them fade. Even if it meant facing the very threat that had once shattered this world, they would stay. But as the weeks stretched into months, one truth became harder to deny. Something was coming. Something vast. Something that had once silenced entire civilizations. And now, a new humanity was here. The silence in the tunnels was never empty. It was filled with the weight of history, with the sound of things unsaid, with the tremble of voices that carried centuries of pain. Humanity had come searching for survivors, but what they found was more than just a handful of beings clinging to life. They had stumbled onto the ghost of a civilization. Each day, the crew worked alongside the aliens, patching old structures, fixing water systems that had been cobbled together for generations, and sharing supplies. But every task was shadowed by questions. Who had abandoned them? What force had left this once thriving world in ruin? The answers were never clear, always wrapped in half-spoken words, cut short by the sharp glances of elders who seemed terrified of saying too much. The survivors spoke in fragments. Some described great cities, towers that once touched the skies, fields that shimmered with life. They remembered songs that filled the air, gatherings that stretched across continents. But all those memories ended with the same bitter phrase: and then they left us. It was never explained who they were. The children whispered it like a story meant to frighten, while the adults spoke it with bitterness that turned their voices into knives. Whatever had happened, it had not been some natural disaster. The way they spoke of it, the destruction had been a choice. Someone had decided they were not worth saving. The humans tried to push for more. They asked careful questions, recorded every detail, and compared notes late at night when the survivors were asleep. But the puzzle never came together. The pieces only made the shadow bigger. And still they stayed. The humans could have left. Their mission was dangerous enough already. But something about those weary faces made leaving impossible. To walk away would have meant becoming part of the very story that had broken this world. A story of abandonment, of silence, of betrayal. At first, the survivors were cautious around their human visitors. They watched every move, studied every word. But slowly trust grew. The children were the first to run toward them, tugging at sleeves, mimicking gestures, daring to smile. The adults followed, not out of faith but out of exhaustion. They had been disappointed too many times before. One of the elders, thin as bone, spoke late one night when the tunnels were quiet. His voice was low, almost broken, but his eyes shone with a fire that had not yet gone out. He told the crew that long ago, when their skies began to fall, their people sent messages across the stars. They begged for help. They begged anyone who could hear them to come. They promised friendship, trade, alliance, anything. They promised loyalty. And for a time ships did come. Other civilizations responded. But their aid was small, hesitant. Promises were made and then quietly broken. One by one their allies disappeared, retreating to their own worlds until only silence remained. When the disaster grew worse, when the planet's crust began to tear and the seas boiled away, the survivors sent one last desperate signal. A plea to anyone who still cared. But no one came. Until now. The elders' words shook the crew. They had heard whispers of a galaxy filled with countless species, but the idea that so many had turned their backs was unbearable. Humanity had its flaws, its wars, its selfishness, but there was something in the human heart that could not stand the thought of leaving someone behind. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about politics. It was about the simple, stubborn refusal to let another voice fall silent in the dark. As days turned into weeks, the humans began to notice changes in the survivors. Faces that had been hollow slowly grew brighter. Their voices grew steadier. For the first time in centuries they began to hope again. And yet, that hope was fragile, like glass resting on the edge of a table, always one breath away from shattering. The tremors in the ground grew more frequent. Sometimes faint, sometimes strong enough to knock tools from hands, they rattled through the tunnels with a steady reminder. The danger was not over. The survivors never explained the cause. Whenever the humans asked, the survivors looked away, their silence heavier than words. One evening, as the crew shared food with the survivors, one of the children asked a question. The words were broken, but the meaning was clear. "Will you leave too?" The crew froze. No one spoke for a long moment. Then one of the humans leaned forward, voice steady but heavy with emotion, and said, "No. We will not leave." The words spread quickly. The survivors whispered them to one another in their own tongue, repeating them like a prayer. And though the humans knew it was a promise that could cost them dearly, none regretted speaking it. But the shadows of the past were never far. Each day brought more hints of a larger story hidden beneath the ruins. Symbols carved into the walls of the tunnels, strange machines buried in the dust, fragments of records that spoke of something vast, an alliance of worlds, an agreement long forgotten. The more the crew uncovered, the clearer it became. This planet had once stood at the heart of something greater. And then, for reasons no one yet understood, that greatness had been erased. At night, the humans gathered in the small chamber that served as their base. They whispered to one another, their voices tense. Some believed the survivors had been abandoned because they were weak. Others thought it was because they had refused to bow to stronger powers. A few whispered a darker thought, that perhaps someone had wanted them gone. The survivors never said. Perhaps they could not. Perhaps they dared not. The tension deepened when the crew's instruments began to pick up faint signals beyond the ruined world. At first, they assumed it was background noise just like the original distress call. But the patterns were too deliberate. Something, or someone, was watching. The humans tried to hide their unease, not wanting to worry the survivors. But the feeling of being observed clung to them like a shadow. And though the signals were faint, they carried a strange familiarity, as though they were connected to the very forces that had once abandoned this world. The more the humans uncovered, the more certain they became that this was not just a mission of mercy. It was a step into a mystery that stretched far beyond one broken planet. And whatever had silenced this civilization might not be finished. One of the crew kept a journal. Each night, they wrote about the faces of the survivors, about the way hope flickered in their eyes, about the way children laughed even in the ruins. But the last entry ended with a single line that chilled everyone who read it. If something comes for them again, it will come for us too. Still, no one suggested leaving. Humanity had made a choice, and choices like this could not be undone. To walk away would not only doom the survivors, it would wound something inside the human spirit itself. The bond between the two peoples grew stronger. The survivors began to teach fragments of their language, simple words first, then more complex ones. They shared stories, half-remembered myths of gods who once walked their skies, legends of heroes who fought to defend their world. Some of the stories ended in triumph, but most ended in silence. It was clear that their culture had been broken, their history shattered. And yet, in the fragments, something shone through. A stubbornness. A refusal to surrender. The humans recognized it instantly. It was the same fire that had carried their own species through endless wars, disasters, and hardships. And in that recognition, a bond was sealed. But the tremors grew stronger. The signals from space grew clearer. And the survivors' warnings grew more urgent. One night, the eldest among them spoke again, his voice shaking as he looked into the eyes of the human commander. "They will come," he said. "They always come when hope begins to rise. That is when they strike. That is when they silence us again." The humans did not know who they were. They did not know what power could erase entire civilizations, what force could terrify survivors into silence after centuries. But they knew one thing: if it came, they would not run. For the first time in their history, the survivors were not alone. And for the first time, humanity realized what it meant to carry the hopes of another species on their shoulders. The ruins whispered of secrets still buried. The tunnels shook with warnings unspoken. And far above the ruined planet, something moved in the dark. The humans didn't have answers. They didn't have certainty. But they had made a promise. And now they would have to keep it. The tremors no longer felt random. At first they had been occasional, like the groan of a broken world struggling to hold itself together. But now they came in patterns, steady, deliberate, as though something deep beneath the ground was shifting with purpose. The survivors no longer tried to hide their fear. Their eyes gave them away. Whenever the tunnels shook, they froze, waiting for something terrible to follow, waiting for the sound they dreaded most. The humans asked again and again what it was, what they were hiding, but the survivors only repeated the same words. They will come. Nothing more. Their silence was worse than answers, because silence meant the truth was too terrifying to speak. The crew worked harder, building stronger shelters, reinforcing tunnels, rationing supplies. They pretended it was just precaution, but everyone knew better. They were preparing for something. The survivors sensed it too. Their voices grew softer, their laughter more fragile, as if joy itself could draw attention from whatever lurked beyond the stars. At night, the humans gathered in the small command chamber. They argued in whispers. Some wanted to send a warning back to Earth, even if it meant revealing their position. Others feared that if they called out, the same fate that had befallen this world would spread to humanity too. The choice tore at them, but no decision was made. Each night ended the same way: tired eyes, clenched jaws, and the silent weight of a question none of them wanted to ask aloud. What if we've already been seen? The signals from space grew clearer. They no longer sounded like random bursts of static. They had rhythm now. A pattern. Almost like someone was answering the faint distress call still buried in the planet's systems. One of the crew spent hours listening to the signals, trying to map them, trying to find meaning. One night, he stumbled into the chamber, pale and shaking, clutching a recording. He played it back, and the sound that filled the air was not static. It was a voice. A voice so distorted and cold it barely seemed alive. The words were fragmented, twisted by distance, but they were clear enough. Silence the echo. The survivors broke down when they heard it. They collapsed to the floor, their hands over their faces, rocking as if they had been struck. The humans rushed to comfort them, but the elder only whispered through trembling lips, "They know." From that night onward, the tension was unbearable. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow deeper. The crew began taking shifts around the clock, watching the sky, monitoring every vibration in the ground. They pretended it was duty, but it was fear that kept them awake. The survivors withdrew further into themselves. Some refused to eat. Others whispered prayers in voices that cracked with despair. The children no longer laughed. Even their eyes carried the weight of knowing what was coming. Yet the humans stayed. They worked harder, tried to smile, tried to give the survivors something to believe in. But the truth was clear: whatever had destroyed the civilization once was returning. And humanity had placed itself directly in its path. The tremors grew stronger. Dust rained from the tunnel ceilings, old supports groaned, and cracks split through walls already weak from centuries of decay. The crew pushed themselves to exhaustion, shoring up the shelters, refusing to give in to panic. They had come here to help, and they would not let fear undo that choice. One night the signals grew louder. Not faint, not distant. Close. Too close. The instruments screamed with warnings as something massive moved into the system. A ship or many ships. The crew gathered around the screens, staring at the shifting data. They couldn't see it yet, but they knew. The sky above the broken planet was no longer empty. The survivors confirmed it with nothing more than their silence. No words. No cries. Just silence, the kind that carried centuries of memory. They had lived this before. They knew what came next. The humans tried to rally them. They promised to stand, to fight, to protect. They promised this time would be different. But even as they spoke, their own voices faltered. Because deep down, each of them wondered the same thing: could they really stop what had once silenced entire civilizations? Days passed in a haze of dread. The signals circled the planet like predators. The tremors in the ground matched their rhythm, as if the very earth itself responded to the presence above. The air grew colder, heavier. Even the stars seemed dimmer. Then the first shadow fell. The crew saw it break through the clouds, an object so large it blotted out the light. It hovered above the ruins in silence, featureless and dark, its presence alone enough to make the survivors collapse in terror. Children clung to their parents, and the elders bowed their heads as if waiting for the inevitable. The humans stared upward, their hearts pounding. This was the moment they had dreaded, the moment when promises would be tested. Every instinct screamed at them to hide, to run, but another instinct burned stronger: stay. The ship remained motionless for hours, casting the planet below into shadow. The crew whispered theories: maybe it was studying them, maybe it was waiting. None of the guesses mattered. What mattered was the truth that pressed down on them all: they had been found. That night the elder spoke one final warning. His voice was soft, almost gone, but every word carried the weight of centuries. When they come, they do not speak. They do not bargain. They do not forgive. They erase. The humans listened, their throats tight, their eyes heavy with fear. But when the elder finished, one of them spoke in return, voice steady despite the shaking of her hands. Then let them come. We will not abandon you. The survivors wept. The next day the shadow moved again. It descended lower, breaking apart into smaller shapes that streaked across the sky like falling stars. The ground shook with each impact. The air filled with the roar of engines and the taste of burning metal. The humans armed themselves with what little they had, standing at the edge of the tunnels as dust rolled through the broken city. Their hearts raced, their mouths dry, but none stepped back. They had made a promise, and this was the moment it would be tested. The survivors huddled in the deepest chambers, their whispers like a prayer that could barely be heard over the tremors. The humans stood above them, waiting, every breath a battle against panic. And then, from the ruins above, came the sound of footsteps. Not many. Just enough to echo. Just enough to remind them that whatever had haunted this planet for centuries had finally returned to finish what it had begun. The tunnels shook. The lights flickered. The shadows deepened. And humanity stood, knowing that what came next would decide not only the fate of the forgotten, but the fate of their own kind. The footsteps above grew louder, heavier, until the tunnels themselves seemed to breathe with each impact. Dust rained from the ceiling, settling on the survivors who crouched together in silence. The children buried their faces in their parents' arms. The humans held their ground, forcing themselves to steady their breathing even as fear clawed at their chests. Then the sound stopped. For a moment the ruins above went still. The crew exchanged tense glances, their weapons clutched tighter, their ears straining for the next sound. The silence was worse than the tremors. It was the silence of something watching. A shrill metallic echo rolled down the tunnels. Not speech. Not words. A frequency so sharp it rattled teeth and made survivors cry out in pain. The humans forced themselves to endure it, covering the survivors' ears, dragging them deeper into the shelter. The sound faded, but the damage was done. They weren't just being hunted. They were being tested. The elder lifted his head, eyes wet but defiant. His voice was almost gone, but the words struck like stone. This is how it began last time. The crew wanted answers, demanded them, but the elder shook his head. If I speak it, they will hear. They always hear. The survivors cowered, but the humans pressed on. They couldn't fight shadows forever. They needed to know what they were facing. And then, as if fate had chosen the moment, the first of the alien machines appeared. It dropped into the ruins like a predator from the sky, legs slamming into the cracked earth, its body glinting with black armor that swallowed light. It wasn't alive, but it wasn't mindless either. The humans saw it in the way its head turned, scanning the tunnels, pausing as if it could sense every heartbeat beneath the ground. Weapons were raised, fingers trembling on triggers. But the machine didn't attack. It simply waited. Then more arrived. Dozens. Their shadows spread across the ruins, encircling the broken city, surrounding the tunnels where the last survivors hid. The crew realized the truth at once. These weren't scouts. They weren't searching. They already knew exactly where their prey was. One of the crew whispered, "They've done this before. They've done it so many times." The elder nodded, tears cutting through the dust on his face. Entire worlds. Not only ours. They come when hope is strongest. They come when we believe we are safe. That is when they strike. The crew's blood went cold. This wasn't about one civilization. This wasn't about one ruined planet. This was a pattern. A purge. And now humanity had stepped into it. The humans argued in frantic whispers, their voices harsh with fear and anger. Some wanted to strike first to prove they would not be cornered. Others insisted it would be suicide, that fighting blind against a force like this would only doom everyone faster. And beneath every argument was the same unspoken truth: they weren't sure if they could win. But retreat was no longer an option. Above, the machines were closing in. Below, the survivors looked at them with wide, desperate eyes. Abandoning them would mean becoming part of the very horror they had sworn to fight against. And then came the second twist, the revelation none of them expected. While exploring the deeper tunnels, one of the humans stumbled upon a sealed chamber. Its door was ancient, its surface carved with symbols the survivors refused to approach. The crew forced it open, driven by desperation, and what they found inside stole the breath from their lungs. It was not a tomb. It was not a shelter. It was a vault. Inside lay machinery unlike anything humanity had ever seen, humming faintly even after centuries of abandonment. And carved into the walls around it were warnings, not in the survivors' language but in dozens of others. Species names, symbols, pleas for remembrance. Whole civilizations etched into the stone, each one crossed out with the same mark. Erased. The survivors collapsed at the threshold, wailing, refusing to enter. The elder whispered that this was the truth they had hidden, the truth too terrible to speak aloud. Their world had not simply been abandoned. It had been chosen as the place to store the memory of all who had been erased. They were not the first. They were simply the last to fall. The humans staggered back, horror burning through them. They understood now why the survivors had been so afraid to tell the full story. This was bigger than betrayal. This was extermination on a scale so vast it defied belief. Civilizations had been wiped from the galaxy, and their names locked away in this tomb of silence. And now humanity's name was about to be added. The realization cut through them like a blade. This was no longer only about saving the survivors. It was about proving that the cycle could be broken. That compassion could outlast fear. That the human will to fight, not for conquest but for others, could stand against the silence that had devoured countless worlds. But above them, the machines moved closer, their steps echoing through the ruins, their shadows stretching longer. The vault's hum grew louder, as if awakening after centuries of dormancy. The survivors begged the humans to seal it again, to let it sleep, but the crew knew there was no turning back. Because what lay inside might be the only weapon they had left. The humans stood torn between two impossible choices: protect the survivors by keeping the vault sealed, or awaken whatever power it held, risking everything in the hope of standing against the enemy. And as the machines descended into the tunnels, their cold light piercing the darkness, the choice could no longer be delayed. The humans gripped their weapons, their hands shaking not with fear but with fury. They had come to save the forgotten, but now they carried the weight of every lost civilization written on those walls. The silence was breaking, and humanity was about to face the true enemy. The storm over the alien ruins broke at last, but not in the way anyone expected. The ground trembled as though the world itself was breathing, and for a moment everyone thought the city would collapse into dust. Humans and aliens alike braced themselves. The lost civilization's halls, lit by ancient power, seemed to respond to the living presence inside them. The humans could feel the weight of countless years pressing down, as if all of history was watching what they would choose to do next. At the center of the alien city, a light bloomed from the core. It pulsed like a heartbeat, slow, steady, growing stronger. The surviving aliens dropped to their knees in awe. For generations they had believed their ancestors were truly gone, wiped out by time and betrayal. Now the walls themselves whispered with voices long forgotten. And it was the humans, still standing firm, who had given them the chance to witness it. But then the air cracked and a shadow stepped through. The rival alien faction that had hunted them across worlds had found a way inside. Their weapons glowed, aimed directly at the humans who stood shielding their newfound allies. The moment stretched thin, every heartbeat a countdown to violence. The humans knew they could not retreat, not after coming this far. If they left, the fragile hope they had sparked would be crushed in seconds. One of the humans shouted for the others to hold their ground. Their voices carried not just determination but something the aliens couldn't quite name: a fierce refusal to abandon anyone even at the cost of their lives. That raw defiance seemed to ripple through the ancient power humming in the ruins. The ground itself shifted, responding to the will of those who chose to stand instead of flee. The hostile aliens opened fire. Light cut through the chamber. Humans threw themselves forward, shielding the survivors behind them, forcing their own bodies into the path of destruction. But as the first blast struck, the ruins surged alive. Shields of shimmering energy unfolded, not from technology, but from the city's core itself. The humans weren't destroyed, they were amplified. The ancient system recognized something familiar in them, something that resonated deeper than genetics or bloodlines. It recognized the choice to stand by the forgotten. The attackers faltered. Their weapons grew dim, energy drained away as the ruins rejected their violence. Panic spread across their ranks, but still they tried to press forward, desperate to finish what they had started. That desperation fed the conflict, each moment growing sharper, more dangerous. The humans pressed back with nothing more than willpower and courage, and somehow it was enough. Step by step, they drove the enemy into retreat, though the effort left them shaking, exhausted, nearly broken. They had no weapons equal to the foe, no technology as advanced, yet the ruins had chosen to answer to them. The survivors of the lost alien race looked on, tears shining in eyes that hadn't known hope in centuries. For the first time they believed they might not be alone anymore. But the climax held one last twist. Just as victory seemed certain, the city's core flared brighter than ever before, and a hidden chamber cracked open. Inside lay not just knowledge of the lost civilization, but evidence of something far larger. A warning carved in stone, etched by hands that had known their own downfall. The message was simple: if you awaken us, you awaken what destroyed us. The humans and their alien allies stared as the truth unfolded. Their enemies had not been the only danger. Something deeper, older, was stirring. The ruins had protected the humans not only because they had chosen to stay, but because a greater darkness was rising beyond the horizon. The choice had been made. They had bound themselves to the forgotten. Now, together they would have to face whatever had once destroyed entire worlds. The chamber fell silent. The enemy fled into the shadows, but the humans knew this was not the end. They had won the battle, yes, but in winning they had unlocked a far greater war. And yet, even as fear tightened in their chests, there was no regret. Because when everyone else had turned away, they had chosen to stay. And that choice would echo across the galaxy. The chamber still glowed faintly, the last ripples of the ancient core slowly dimming into silence. Dust hung in the air like smoke after a fire, and for a long moment no one spoke. The humans stood in the wreckage, their chests heaving, their bodies aching with exhaustion. They had survived the storm, the enemy, and the fury of the ruins themselves. But survival was not victory, not yet. The message carved into the stone still burned in their minds. The aliens they had fought to protect gathered in a circle, their faces a mixture of awe, gratitude, and fear. They had always believed the ruins were nothing more than a grave, a silent reminder of their lost ancestors. Now they saw them alive again, but the truth was heavier than they had imagined. Their ancestors hadn't simply vanished, they had been destroyed. And the humans, by standing their ground, had awoken not just a memory but the shadow of that destruction. One of the humans stepped forward, pressing a hand against the cool stone wall where the warning was written. The words were carved deep, etched with desperate care. This was not a triumphal message left for future generations. It was a plea. A cry across time, begging anyone who discovered it not to repeat the same mistake. And yet, here they stood, already entangled in the same chain of events. The group gathered closer, humans and aliens alike. Tension lingered between them, but there was no denying what they had just witnessed. The humans had chosen to protect them when no one else would, and the ruins themselves had responded. It was a bond forged not by blood or shared history but by choice. A fragile alliance, but real. Still, doubt ran through the crowd. The aliens looked at the humans with wide, searching eyes. Why had the ruins chosen them? Why had the ancient systems answered not to the descendants of the lost civilization, but to outsiders? The humans didn't have a clear answer. All they could offer was the truth, their willingness to stand even when it meant dying. It wasn't enough to explain everything, but it was enough to be believed. Slowly, the group began to move through the ruins, searching for whatever the attackers had left behind. Weapons were scattered, but most had gone dark, drained of energy when the ruins had rejected their violence. It was strange to see such advanced tools lying useless, as if they were nothing more than broken sticks. The humans picked up a few pieces not out of greed but because they knew they would need them. The warning had made it clear. Something worse was coming. When they emerged back into the open air, the storm outside had broken. The skies were clearing, the clouds pulling apart to reveal the first hints of sunlight. The ground was still wet, the air heavy, but there was a strange calmness too. For the first time since they had landed, the world didn't feel hostile. It felt as though it was watching them, waiting to see what they would do. The survivors built a fire that night at the edge of the ruins. They were silent at first, each lost in their own thoughts. Some stared into the flames, others at the stars above, but all carried the same weight inside them. The humans had given everything, and in return they had been shown both victory and a warning. The aliens had gained allies they never expected, but also a glimpse of a danger far greater than their long war. When one of the younger aliens finally spoke, their voice was trembling but strong. They asked the question everyone had been avoiding. What happens now? It was the humans who answered. Not with certainty but with conviction. They said that whatever was coming they would not face it alone. That the choice made in the ruins, to stand, to protect, to fight side by side, was not a moment but a promise. And promises mattered. There was silence again after that, but it was different this time. Less heavy. More alive. Over the following days they worked together. The humans taught the aliens how to repair what could be saved from the attackers' weapons, and in return the aliens shared what they knew of the ruins. It wasn't much. Centuries of fear had kept them away, but there were stories, fragments of songs, echoes of what their ancestors had once believed. Piece by piece a picture formed. The ancient civilization had been vast, stretching across worlds. But it had been consumed by something greater, something merciless. The warning in the chamber was the last trace of their resistance. The humans listened carefully. Every detail mattered. They knew that if history had buried such a force once, it could rise again. And the ruins seemed to agree. Whenever they drew near, the systems pulsed faintly, as if alive, as if waiting. It was no longer a tomb. It was awake. Word of what had happened spread quickly. The enemy who had attacked them returned to their leaders, broken and terrified. They spoke of humans wielding ancient power, of ruins that rejected violence, of survival where none should have been possible. Fear spread through their ranks like fire through dry grass. For them this was not just a defeat. It was a revelation they could not control. The humans knew they had little time. The enemy would regroup, or worse, they would dig deeper into the warning and realize the truth themselves. But instead of despair, there was determination. They had faced impossible odds and survived. They had seen what courage could do, not just to themselves but to those around them. If a handful of humans could stand against an army and awaken the ruins, then perhaps the galaxy wasn't as hopeless as it seemed. The final days on that world were spent preparing. They repaired their ship with what little they had, patching the scars of battle. The aliens they had protected chose not to remain behind. They wanted to stand beside the humans, no longer hidden, no longer afraid. It was a decision that carried risk, but it was also a declaration. On the morning they left, the sun rose high and clear, shining over the ruins like a promise. The humans looked back one last time. They had come seeking answers and had found more questions. They had fought for survival and had uncovered a destiny larger than themselves. But the feeling inside them was not despair. It was something stronger. As the ship lifted from the ground, leaving the ruins behind, one of the humans whispered what everyone was thinking but none had said aloud. "We're not done yet." The words carried through the cabin and silence followed them. Not heavy but filled with meaning. Because the truth was simple. Humanity had always been underestimated. Seen as fragile, divided, reckless. But when it mattered, when the choice was to stand or to fall, humans always stood. And now, with allies at their side, they were no longer standing only for themselves. The stars stretched before them, vast and endless. Somewhere out there, the shadow that had destroyed an entire civilization was waiting. But somewhere out there, too, was the chance to prove that humanity's strength was not just in weapons or technology. It was in loyalty. In the refusal to abandon one another. In the choice to fight for more than survival, for connection, for meaning, for hope. The war between human and alien had not ended. It had only changed. No longer a war of domination or fear, but a struggle against something far greater. And this time humanity would not face it alone. In the quiet of space, as their ship drifted toward the unknown, there was no fear. Only resolve. Because in the end, it wasn't the ruins that had changed everything. It was the choice made inside them. The choice to stay, to fight, to protect. A choice that would echo across worlds, across time. And somewhere, in the silence between stars, the darkness stirred. It had heard the ruins awaken. It had felt the humans rise. And it was coming. But the humans smiled anyway. Because whatever came next, they would meet it together.